His late mother's last wish was to become a civil servant. A portrait of a woman with short dark hair stood on a shelf, surrounded by bouquets of flowers. There were 2 black ribbons on the picture frame. Was it all because she was a homemaker with no steady income? She lived with the idea that a safe job was the best job. It was those ridiculous words that were his mother's last wish, so his top priority in life was safety. A young boy was standing near a mountain of flowers, wearing a black suit and big circles under his eyes. His face was tired. His hair was dark and brown, just like his eyes. While the other kids were having fun and sleeping, he studied hard. For all that time, his name has never left the first line in the rating of academic performance. A young man in a blue sweater was sitting at a desk, flipping through a textbook. Naturally, he managed not only to enter a prestigious university, but also to finish it safely. The tall building was rising in the sunlight. He also passed the written exam for entering the civil service successfully. A message was opened on the phone screen with the contents: web newsletter, information about the results of the written exam for admission to the Civil Service Level 5 from 2020, as well as an announcement about the submission of documents available on the website. 9:15 a.m. Finally, the final stage has arrived, the interview. A man in a business suit was lying on the marble floor, blood streaming from his head. So he died. For him, a man who had lived with a belief in safety, death was instantaneous. The man lay staring at nothing, his eyes wide as blood flowed from his mouth. It was too simple a thing in his entire life. The warriors fought the goblins, cutting off their heads with spears and swords. The man with war paint and short red hair frowned and grinned. Humans and monsters rushed at each other in 2 waves. At first, he thought he was having an ordinary dream. The world that appeared before his eyes was not the world he knew. Humans and monsters continued to attack each other as everything was engulfed in flames. It was more like a game or a cartoon. He saw monsters and mages fighting. The battle mage charged straight at the monster in front of him. In the room, sunlight came in through the window. There was a bed and a nightstand all around, and the walls were made of stone. He was reborn in this world. A small child lay in a cradle and pulled small hands in front of him. He didn't understand what had happened. Once upon a time there was a major invasion of the devil and his minions. The devil stood at the head of his army, towering over them and leading them forward. Everything was on fire. He conquered the world with incredible power, killing many people in the process. The devil was grinning ominously as steam came out of its mouth. People were trying to escape in the purple glare. When there was no hope left and the whole world was ready to die, the devil made a mistake that cost him his life. The devil's head flew off, severed from its body. He trespassed on a village inhabited by a tribe that was too tough for him. The head was lying on the ground as blood spread out on the ground. The strongest people of that time, called ravens. The people were standing in front of the fallen devil, their eyes flashing red. A blooming forest surrounded by green animals. The sky was bright and the sun was shining. Suddenly, there was a loud explosion in the middle of the forest. They began to resound in different parts of the forest, plunging the forest into dust and leaving fragments and remnants of rocks and torn tree branches at the site of explosions. A silhouette appeared in the middle of the smoke. It was a purple-colored dragon with glowing orange eyes. It opened its mouth wide and let out a loud cry. The dragon was suddenly distracted by the sound of people behind him playing rock, paper, and scissors. The dragon turned its muzzle in the direction of the sound as the 3 figures continued to play rock, paper, and scissors. The 3 pieces played again until one got a rock and the other a piece of paper. One of the guys with a short crew cut flexed his fists and said with a satisfied smile on his face that he had run into the wrong person. It was the eldest son, Galahad Blade. Behind him, there was another youth with long hair tied back in a ponytail, who was looking at the hand that was clenched into a fist with a puzzled face. It was the youngest son, Cowan Blade. The last one standing was a third youth with dark hair and eyes. Galahad Blade turned to the other 2 with a triumphant face and shouted loudly to Dan that settling the matter with a game of rock, paper, scissors was a great idea, because it could solve any situation almost instantly. The third boy was Danberg Blade, and he stared straight ahead without much enthusiasm on his face. Galahad shouted one last time that it was time to attack this dragon. Galahad Blade moved closer and stood in front of the dragon as the monster towered over him and screamed loudly. Galahad grinned and took up a fighting stance, a grin on his face as he talked about how much money he would get for the dragon eyes. The dragon immediately screamed louder in response, opening its mouth. Galahad shouted back at him to stop talking, and then he lunged at the dragon, striking out and tearing the dragon in 2. The dragon fell to the ground as Galahad rode happily beside it, wondering how long it had been since the dragon had appeared. Galahad continued to ride until Cowan, standing behind him, made a sound of displeasure and said that he only made them do what he was good enough at. Danberg Blade and Kakyoin broke off their attention and looked behind them as the goblin tribe appeared in front of them. They were all fat, bald, and green-skinned, with 2 sharp teeth sticking out of their mouths, and their eyes were glowing red. They growled, and Kakyoin and Danberg Blade stared at them blankly and didn't understand what was going on. After a moment, Kakyoin smiled happily and said that they were orcs, and at the same time he rushed to the crowd with weapons ready and shouted that they were his, while Danberg Blade stood to the side and watched what was happening. Danberg Blade stared in front of him in silence, his face and brows furrowed in displeasure, while Kakyoin laughed madly and shouted for them all to die. Danberg Blade watched as Kakyoin hacked the trolls apart, and Galahad joined him. Danberg Blade felt like she was going to live a normal life after her rebirth. Never would the boy have thought that he would become a member of a warlike race that hunts even dragons. The sun shone on a small village. The houses were arranged in a row. Danberg Blade threw open the door to the house and loudly told his father that he wanted to go to the archipelago. The man turned around when he heard the young man's words and asked him what he was talking about with a puzzled face. It was the head of the village, Doomstone Blade. The man had long neck-length hair, a beard, and a scar on his brow. Danberg Blade went inside the house and approached his father, telling him that he had absolutely nothing to do here. His father asked him what nonsense he was talking about and why he thought he had nothing to do here. After all, he is smart and wields a sword as well as his brothers. Besides, he is the best at using magic in the village. Danberg Blade was a little taken aback by his words, humming a little in response. He replied with an uncertain face that he wanted to say that he wanted to work in a place where he would be appreciated and respected. His father asked him again what he was talking about, and added how he would like to join the guard run by his older brother, or he can become part of a group of warriors led by Cowan. Danberg Blade clenched his hands into fists, and said loudly that if he joined them, he would have to fight battles every day. And my father, crossing his arms behind his back, said that it was all very well, and Danberg Blade that he didn't want to. The father smiled with a sly smile on his face and said what about the trade that his sister does then? Danberg Blade thought to himself that he would have to travel to various cities, selling body parts of various monsters, and using the proceeds to buy food for the house. Danberg Blade's mind immediately conjured up an image of him sitting next to baskets of various monster parts with a not-so-happy face. Danberg frowned and thought that the time required to travel between villages was at least 10 days. Danberg looked at his father plaintively and told him not to do this to him. My father continued to smile in response and added that he probably didn't really like trading either, and how he liked the idea of becoming the head of the village back then. Danberg was instantly startled by his words, his face pale and his eyes wide. He immediately became flustered and asked his father what the suddenness was. Suddenly, the woman fell down from above and moved quickly towards the man, a knife in her other hand, and a crazy smile on her face. The girl had long brown hair and her eyes glowed red. She smiled and greeted her father. This was the second daughter, Raiza Blade. Her father greeted her with a smile and asked Raiza if she had eaten yet. Raiza said nothing and swung the blade at her father. With a smile on her face, Raiza asked her father if he had forgotten that she was on a diet, while a bright fire shone in her other hand, which was immediately launched in the direction of the man. His father easily waved him off and, with the same deadpan smile, told him that his daughter looked just fine. And what kind of diet could we talk about? And that he would be very happy if she gained some muscle mass. Raiza continued to attack her father and told him in a rude way to make his father better shut up. Danberg continued to watch the scene with a grim face. Inwardly, he thought that the longer he stood here, the more the situation became even stranger. Danberg left the house and headed toward the woods. After a while, he arrived at the entrance of the cave. Danberg frowned. Now he has no choice but to resort to Plan B. Many red eyes stared out from the cave. Danberg walked slowly into the cave as the creatures moved toward him. The sun shone down on the row of houses. The man was sitting at a table, and several other people were sitting on either side of him. One of the men at the table asked what had happened since he had called all the elders together. The man smiled and said that he just wanted to say something to all of them, and said that he had chosen a successor. The other man turned around as soon as he heard his words and asked if he was sick or if he had caught an infection that he didn't know about. The man replied that he wasn't and that he was fine, and in response, the man asked what was the reason that he suddenly started talking about a successor. The man smiled and said that he knew everything about his restless nature, and in response, the other man said with displeasure that he also found something to justify himself. The head of state averted his eyes when they began to question him and clarify who exactly he chose as his successor, the senior or the middle one. The man closed his eyes and said nothing, then replied that he chose the youngest son. People turned in his direction in confusion and started whispering when one of them asked why he decided to choose him. The man was silent at first, then smiled and told them that they all wanted to know the reason, and that in fact everything was simple, because the strongest person should become the head of the village. The elders frowned and stared at the man in silence. One of the voices asked, was his youngest son stronger than his older brothers? He replied that of course, unlike Galahad and Cowain, he was still not strong enough, and besides, the middle son had the best fighting skills and techniques. One of the men jumped up from his seat and slammed his hands on the table, asking him why he had chosen Denberg then. The head was silent for a while. An image of Denberg with a burning power in her hand appeared in his mind. He replied that it was Denberg who would become a genius magician in the future. One of the elders stared at him blankly when the other exclaimed and asked what kind of magician he was talking about. And didn't the headman understand that magic was nothing more than just tricks? The man smiled and replied that yes, it was true, but Denberg was able to defeat the dragon single-handedly using ordinary magic and magical martial arts. The elders immediately reacted in response to his words. The man continued and said that at that time he was 12 years old. Little Denberg was standing next to the slain dragon, holding a knife in his other hand. The elders immediately exclaimed and started talking about how it was impossible and sounded like obvious nonsense. Magic is the ability to control and release magic power, whereas magic martial art is the ability to circulate magic power inside one's body. One of the men continued to speak loudly and added, as the head of the group listened in silence, that by using these two units together, the magic power could create chaos inside the body, which would simply destroy the person. The head listened to him and asked with a serious face if they really thought that he didn't know it before. However, his son said that fighting wasn't something difficult, and he also compared it to reading books while eating. The image of little Denberg charging at the dragon popped into his mind. The elders were silent. Suddenly, a young man burst into the office and called out loudly to the elder, opening the front door at the same time. The man said that it was important for him to see this, and the head looked at him questioningly. They went outside and saw mountains of orc corpses lying in a layer on the ground near their settlement. One of the voices said that someone left all these corpses near the entrance of the village, and that in his opinion, there should be about 40 monsters here. Another man shouted out and told them to call for people as soon as possible, and that it would take about 100 people to butcher the bodies before they started to rot. The girl's unexpected voice came from behind the man, and he turned to look at her as the girl ran towards him and held a letter in her hands, saying that it was a letter from Denberg. The headman picked up the letter and opened it. On the paper was the text of a letter that said, "To your beloved family. I decided to leave the village and go to new places, but we are not parting forever. I just want to find a job that suits me." The man continued to read the letter as the crowd began to disperse to their concerns and check what had happened. The letter went on to say, "I took an ID card and some money from the safe, and in return, I will leave you about 40 monsters that were defeated. Their body parts will be worth a lot more than the money I took." The man pursed his lips in silence. Suddenly, he turned to the head of security, and the man behind him answered. He turned around and, with a serious look and furrowed brow, told him to go find Denberg Blade immediately. Denberg, meanwhile, was running along the road, a dark green cloak draped over his shoulders, a frown on his face, thinking that they probably should have discovered the bodies of those monsters by now. And since their blood contains poison, toxic substances evaporate into the air as the body rots. In other words, the longer the bodies lie there, the more the ground around the corpses will become wildly dangerous and uninhabitable. The ground began to be soaked with purple fumes under the ogre's corpses. Since it would take so many people to clear the entrance of the monster corpses, the number of pursuers would be greatly reduced. Denberg moved quickly over the rocks, jumping from one to the other. The image of a woman chained to a bed by pipes and with her eyes dimmed appeared in his mind, telling him that safety is above all else, and that this is why he should be engaged in something like public service. Denberg frowned and clenched his teeth. Inwardly, he asked his father for forgiveness and reflected that in this life, he wanted to achieve his own goal. Sister gathered the rest of the clan around the table and leaned her hands on it, a huge map lying on the table. The girl said that Denberg would move in those places where there would be the most crowded people, so that they could not pick up his trail. She added that nevertheless, a little more and it will soon be in her hands. The girl grinned and asked herself where did their cute little brother run off to, and that his sister would find him. It was the eldest daughter, Hestia Blade. A huge crowd of warriors and ninjas moved out of the village. From this moment, the operation to find Danberg begins. One part of the men ran in the other direction. This was the first group that was going to go along the main roads, and the second group will explore the trails. A few more men separated and bent over the ground. 3. The group must block all entrances and exits to the forest. Hestia was standing with a flag that fluttered in the wind, and a crowd of other ninjas were standing below and listening intently to her orders. The girl smiled as a black raven landed on her shoulder, its eyes sparkling a bright red. The voice said loudly that it hoped for everyone, and at the same time the crow flew up, and Hestia watched the bird go, looking up at the sky. She smiled and thought to herself that her little brother would definitely not succeed. Danberg continued on his way, still running through the woods. It was already night outside. Suddenly, a sign nearby caught his attention. Danberg stopped abruptly in front of the sign. Behind the sign were several tents, with huge skulls of horned animals on top. It was Camp Number 2, 200 kilometers from the village. It was a resting place for merchants who were engaged in selling in various localities. Danberg managed to cover the distance that usually takes 2 days and 4 hours. The guy took out his watch from his pocket and looked at it carefully, breathing heavily. At this rate, it will only take him about 3 minutes 4 days. However, one of his brothers is the fastest person in the village, so very soon he will be able to catch up with him. Danberg had no choice but to walk a little way in the opposite direction, so that he could come out on a road that wasn't marked on the map. Danberg looked toward the dark, dense forest as he pondered. In his village, at the same time, the windows of some buildings were burning, and a man suddenly burst into Hestia's house and said in a loud voice, opening the door, that they had found traces of the young master. The girl was immediately distracted by his words and turned to the man, asking where exactly. The bald man replied that it was near the second camp, but that was where they ended. Hestia looked at him questioningly, her mouth hanging open in surprise. She immediately leaned over the table again and looked at the map on the table. Near the third camp there were only rocks and forests. To get out of the Olympus forest, Danberg will need to walk a little in the opposite direction, and in addition, after sunset in the forest is very weak visibility. Hestia stared thoughtfully at the map in front of her. She turned to one of the men and asked the minister if he had found out what was missing. The man nodded uncertainly and said yes, and that everything of value was still there and only the blanket was missing. The girl immediately started up on the spot. She frowned and thought about how the Olympus forest was called the land of doom for mages. Due to the fact that their village is located in the middle of this forest, they had to draw a magic circle that allows them to use magic without problems. The Olympus forest is a place where magic is usually much more difficult to use, because that's where wizards' mana fluctuates so much. Danberg, since he had destroyed 40 monsters, he probably didn't have any strength left at all right now. The girl thought to herself as she held the pen in her hand and continued to write something down. She looked at the map and continued to reason that there were several places near Camp 2 that could be used for camping. She looked down and thought that she was sure that Danberg was right there, that he needed to recuperate and rest. It was already a dark night outside, and a huge cave stood in the middle of the forest. Danberg said in a trembling voice that it was very cold here. He crawled inside and wrapped the blanket around himself, thinking that he knew the temperature would drop a lot during the night, but he didn't even think that much, and he needed to get some more blankets. Danberg took out the mug and looked at it, holding it in one hand, and tried to light the fire in the other, but it went out in the same second. Danberg looked down at his hand, wrapped in a blanket, and thought that, as expected, in the forest, his magic was beyond his control. Danberg frowned and thought about concentrating and trying again. After a while, a flame lit up in his hand, and he smiled contentedly at what finally happened. He put his hand with the flame to the mug and warmed the bottom of it, then drank the hot liquid. Danberg's face flushed and he smiled contentedly, saying that he was finally feeling good. Suddenly Danberg was interrupted and 3 men appeared at the entrance of the cave, one of them holding a torch and shouting loudly in the direction of Danberg that they had finally found the young master. Danberg snorted in surprise as the men ran up to him and tried to grab him. Danberg dodged the first man and threw a punch, sweeping past him. He landed behind them, just as the men started attacking him from different directions. Danberg easily avoided the blow and counterattacked one of the attackers as the other began to swing. Danberg slapped the other man across the face. With a smile on his face, the guy kept his fist ready and said that in order to grab him, it was worth bringing more than 3 people. One of the men with long hair smiled nervously and chuckled, saying that yes, it looked like it. Screams rang out in the cave. Danberg was already running away, still running at a brisk pace through the woods. It was still dark. With a worried face to himself, he thought that he didn't think they could have ended up here purely by accident. Hestia must be in charge of the squads, and she knows exactly how he'll move. Danberg reached the light and saw several people standing nearby. Inwardly, he kept thinking that it wasn't that he hadn't expected this development, but he still needed to hurry once again. He saw two men in front of him holding torches, cloaks draped over their shoulders. Danberg knew they were already there when he noticed another man standing next to them. Danberg crouched behind a tree, thinking nervously that there was no way he could be caught so soon. Meanwhile, a bird began to fly up behind him. A huge crow flew up to him and began to call loudly, giving away the guy's location. Danberg spun around in surprise and looked at the bird in horror. In a dissatisfied voice, he began to tell the bird to be quiet, while the crow continued to call loudly as it flew into the air. The people nearby immediately heard the commotion and turned in the direction where Danberg was hiding and loudly said that the young master was here and needed to be captured immediately. Danberg began to run away, while voices followed him through the forest and asked the master to stop running. Hestia was standing next to the map table when the man entered the office and loudly announced that they had found the fugitive. The girl smiled contentedly and thought to herself that her calculations were correct after all. She straightened up and loudly told him to order all the soldiers to form a siege around the place where they found her brother. She spun around, her brow furrowed as the girl continued to talk loudly about how the operation needed to involve everyone without exception. A crow was perched on the arm of one of the men with a serious face. They knew that Danberg was definitely hiding somewhere. Hestia kept saying loudly that they should search all the trees, caves, and bushes and find him immediately, and never let the fugitive escape. A huge crowd of people began to scour the forest, looking into the dense thickets, into the cave where he had been before, studying the entire forests. The sun, meanwhile, had already begun to rise slowly, lighting up the surrounding area with bright rays. The flags above the houses of the settlement fluttered slowly in the wind. Hestia was sitting at the table with her arms crossed as two other men stood next to her. She frowned and sat in silence when her father came into the office, arms folded behind his back, and said the sun was up, asking if they hadn't found Danberg yet. She turned her head in his direction when she heard a voice in the doorway. He moved closer to her and she smiled, looking up at him and telling him not to worry and that it was only a matter of time before he caught Danberg. Her father told her that if so, then everything was fine. He noticed the blueprints on the map and shifted his gaze to them. The map showed a map of the area and several circles around it with directions pointed to the side. My father asked why the soldiers were not stationed at the top. The girl bowed her head and replied that there was a cliff in that direction. She looked down at the map and asked the man who entered how many people had discovered Danberg for the first time. The man thought a little, but then answered that there were 3-4 people in total, and the girl immediately started up. She leaned over the table again and thought about what he'd said about 3-4 people. Hestia frowned and thought to herself that if she were in Danberg's shoes, she would just knock out those people and wait there, so why did he decide to run away? Suddenly, a place marked on the map caught her attention. Had he deliberately given them his location? But for what purpose? To gather all the soldiers in one place. Danberg continued on his way, continuing to run through the forest area. The sun was already high. Hestia wondered why, since there was nothing but a cliff on the other side. Suddenly, she had an epiphany and stared blindly ahead. Was it because this boy was going to use magic in the forest? Danberg continued to run through the forest with a serious expression on his face. Hestia thought for a moment, and then in a loud voice, she told the people behind her to go to the soldiers immediately, and tell them to go to Olympia's cliff. Danberg was at the edge of the cliff. Water glistened from below the rocks, illuminated by the rays from above. Danberg stopped at the edge and looked down. Suddenly, he heard a noise behind him, and at the same time, shells flew in his direction, and there were several people running towards him. Danberg dodged and looked at the people in front of him. Vivaksha, who threw the projectiles at him, sighed heavily and said that he was finally caught. The two men behind her were also trying to catch their breath. Danberg smiled nervously when he saw one of the sisters standing in front of him. Suddenly, with a loud shout, there was another guy behind him, his middle brother, who raised his sword over him and announced that he was also here. He launched a random, fast attack while Danberg dodged his blows and listened to him complain about how terrified Danberg was of using dirty tricks. Danberg, with a calm and even face, said that it was really possible that he had been discovered. The brother continued to attack and added that it would be better for him to return home, to avoid creating even bigger problems than he already did. Danberg mumbled something uncertainly in response, and the man added that there was no way to solve the situation with a simple conversation now, and that he should probably cut off one of his hands. The boy continued to swing his sword as Danberg dodged his blows. Danberg looked ahead in surprise when suddenly there was a loud sound and part of the mountain broke off from the ledge. His brother stood in front of him with a surprised face, while Danberg smiled and stood a little unsteadily and told him that he had missed. In the next second, part of the ground on which Danberg was standing broke off, and he flew down the cliff. All the others immediately rushed to him, but before they could grab him, Danberg disappeared over the surface of the water. They looked down and saw no sign of the boy, wondering where he had gone. Suddenly, their attention was diverted by something behind them that lit up with a blue flame, and they both drawled the name Danberg in unison. Hestia stood leaning over the table, wondering why she hadn't guessed it right away. The girl frowned and added that if you somehow cross that cliff, it will no longer be considered the territory of the forest, and in that case, he will be able to use magic. Danberg soared into the sky, surrounded by a bright blue light as his brother and sister looked up at him. They asked him when he had learned this magic. Danberg apologized to them and added that he still lacked a lot compared to them, but they didn't have to worry because he would be fine. He also added that they should tell their father that Danberg was immensely grateful to him for everything. The middle brother looked at him in surprise, his mouth hanging open. Danberg continued to hang in the air and thanked everyone one last time, while people from below tried to reach him and asked him to stop. Danberg waved at them with a smile and said that he would definitely write to them. A bright flash of blue light shone out, and Danberg immediately shot into the sky with a quick movement. The man behind his brother reached for the arrows and asked if he should shoot an arrow at Danberg, and his brother said with a disgruntled face, what would happen if he suddenly fell and got hurt from such a great height? Sister stood behind him and asked him what they should do now, since they couldn't go after him right now. My brother said nothing, and then added that they should go back now. The sky was shining brightly. It was already slowly getting dark outside. The houses were lit up by the setting sun. The father was sitting with the elders again at the table, and one of the voices asked if it was not nonsense to appoint the youngest child as the head of the village. After all, he had lived on Earth for only some 16 years. The man replied that he had not mentioned that Danberg would take his place right now, and one of the people sitting there interrupted him and said that it was worth stopping, especially since he was no longer even in their village. The other man said that they had a different problem now anyway. He glanced sideways at the chief and added that if his son did something, would he be willing to take responsibility for his actions? The others in the office took up his words and started talking about what was right and who knew what this boy was capable of. Because if he wanted to, he could destroy an entire country, and he had to be caught before he did any harm. The head didn't say anything in response, and then with a calm face replied that as they all know, catching his son Danberg, who had magic, would be very difficult. The other man immediately shouted out with a displeased face that it was difficult, because you can just go after him and that's all. The head explained that if he left the village, he would be followed immediately, and the others in the hall looked at him carefully. He explained that this will create misunderstandings and problems on the part of other states. He was told that then he would simply let things slide, because it was necessary to take at least some actions. The man frowned slightly and was silent for a while before replying that he had someone on his mind. The man who will bring Danberg home. The row of houses was lit up by the sun. Danberg stood on a street surrounded by small houses and turned his gaze upward. Danberg was covered in small abrasions and walked forward along the settlement street. He finally arrived at the village. Danberg frowned a little and turned around when he heard a commotion behind him. He was surprised to see several guards surrounding him from different directions. Danberg smiled, surprised and nervous, not quite sure what was going on. 10 minutes ago, loud voices began to be heard all over the street saying that there was a thief and that he should be captured immediately. A man was running down the street at a fast pace, carrying something in his hands. The blonde man looked behind him and laughed with a contented, sly smile, shouting after them to try to catch him. Suddenly he saw Danberg's back in front of him and shouted loudly for him to get out of the way. The man slammed into it and flopped onto his back, dropping the contents in his hands. He hissed in displeasure and frowned at him, telling him that he was a fool, and that he had told him to get out of his way. Danberg smiled sweetly and asked if he was okay, hovering over the man on top of him and apologizing, saying that he just didn't have an extra pair of eyes in the back of his head. There was already a crowd of people behind them, pointing their fingers in their direction, and shouting loudly that he was a thief and that they should catch him immediately. The thief immediately looked behind him nervously and clenched his teeth, frowning. He got up and nudged Danberg with his shoulder, telling her to back off, and started running again. The thief raced through the streets while another man ran after him and ordered him to stop, to which the thief sarcastically replied if he would have stopped in his place. Danberg looked back at them in silence. However, something suddenly caught his attention. The thief continued to run away, thinking that he had already successfully lost his pursuers and was wondering what a sucker the man was, when Danberg appeared in front of him like a shadow and with a calm face demanded him to give up his bag. The thief immediately screamed in surprise and staggered back. He yelled in frustration about what it was all about and how he'd managed to get here so quickly. Danberg stepped in front of him and calmly asked why the thief had stolen his bag. The thief pulled out a knife and held it out in front of him, frowning and clenching his jaw, telling him what nonsense he was talking about. Danberg was right behind him in an instant, and with a grim expression on his face, he told him to just hand over the things in a nice way and go where he was going. The thief immediately started on the spot. He whirled around behind him, swinging the knife with a loud cry. However, as soon as he turned around, he noticed that Danberg was no longer behind him. The thief let out a surprised drawl when Danberg was already behind him again, saying that apparently it was impossible to solve the problem with simple conversations, and the thief looked behind him in surprise, noticing the guy. He was about to swing his knife again, frowning, but Danberg's hand came close to his face in a quick motion and he flicked it, causing the thief to immediately fly off in the other direction with a loud cry of pain. With a loud crash, the thief slammed into the wall, and Danberg said with a calm expression that he was right, and he tried to hit him as gently as possible. He moved closer to the thief and leaned over him, holding out his hand and apologizing, saying that it must have hurt, and the thief immediately screamed and backed away, rolling in the shards and shouting for him to get away from him. Danberg calmly replied that he had asked for his bag when a loud voice interrupted them and ordered them to stop immediately. Several men in plate armor and helmets, led by another man with a serious face, appeared behind them. The man frowned and sternly ordered them that if they moved, they would be killed immediately. Danberg turned his head and smiled slightly, telling them to wait and that there was some misunderstanding between them. The thief immediately jumped up and started running away with a loud shout. Danberg was about to run in his direction when the guard commander loudly ordered him not to move, and that he immediately continue to stay where he was. Danberg looked back at them grimly and said nothing. After some time, Danberg was behind bars with a not very happy face. He was looking at the guards who were standing at the table. Nearby, a single lamp hung on the wall illuminated the space. They were talking among themselves and talking about how there didn't seem to be any weapons, and the other one told him to look better, and there must be something, and how he would attack other people without weapons. Danberg said nothing grimly. Suddenly, one of the men came up to his cell and told him that he was seeing him for the first time in this village. And where did he come from? Danberg hesitated slightly, looking at the man in front of him. Danberg wondered grimly what was going on here, and maybe he should just run away. The man interrupted his thoughts and demanded his ID card. Danberg put his hand behind his back and it began to glow with a faint blue light. He thought about how thank God he had brought his sister's ID card with him. Space. After a few seconds, a piece of paper formed in his hand behind his back and he gently grabbed it. Danberg handed the security guard his ID card with a nervous smile. Danberg was able to change the name by magic. The commander took the paper in his hands and looked at it carefully, studying the contents. The man's face immediately showed shock, and he began to apologize and say that he did not recognize him at first and that he was very sorry and that he had sinned. Danberg looked at the man in front of him in surprise, not quite sure what was going on. The commander went to another guard and loudly ordered him not to stand still and immediately released the master. Danberg smiled nervously as he watched. Danberg was outside, the sun still shining brightly in the sky. Danberg was standing with the ID card in his hands, a puzzled expression on his face, when behind him, several guards bowed deeply and loudly told him to be careful. Danberg stared blankly at the paper and wondered what had just happened, and had he conjured up the identity card of some important nobleman. There were several inscriptions on the paper, and in the lower right corner there was a seal. Danberg frowned and thought that this was all very well, but he might have a problem. Suddenly, his attention shifted to the salesman. A man was standing behind a counter with various pastries. The guy looked in that direction and realized that in all 3 days he had not even had a dewdrop in his mouth. Danberg moved closer to the counter and saw several racks of various baked goods. He carefully examined the contents and asked the man how much the bagels cost, and the merchant replied that he could see the price of 2 felk for himself. Danberg fumbled in his cloak and pulled out a large round silver coin, wondering uncertainly if it would be enough. The merchant immediately jumped up and fussed about how he didn't know Danberg was the count's son, and began to apologize in the same way for his past rudeness. Danberg looked at him uncertainly, not quite sure what was going on. The guy smiled awkwardly and waved his hand, telling him that everything was fine and that he should just sell him a bagel. The merchant was still fussing and begging for forgiveness, saying that he wouldn't have any change from what Danberg had given him, and if they need something, they can just pick it up for free. Danberg stared at him questioningly, then turned around and said that if he did, he would just leave. The merchant began to bow low and thank him with his head lowered. Danberg stepped back and looked more closely at the silver coin in his hand, a puzzled expression on his face. Does this coin really have that much value? Danberg thought that she would probably be accepted somewhere. Meanwhile, the sky was shining brightly without a single cloud on it. The guy continued to go around the shopping places, and in each and the next one he was told that it was too much, or let him spare, because they would not have anything to change it for. The next stores said the same thing and said that they couldn't get him change even if they collected all their money. And even if they sold their building, they wouldn't be able to get the right amount. The sun began to set slowly. Danberg was sitting outside one of the houses while the rain was pouring down hard. Danberg was completely drenched, and with a grim face, he thought that he had money, but there was no way he could use it. Danberg still hasn't learned all the currencies of this world. And how valuable was this coin? If he had known this was going to happen, he would have learned. Suddenly, someone's footsteps squelched on the wet ground next to him. The voice next to him said that it had finally found him, and Danberg turned in the direction of the voice. The thief was standing in front of him with a satisfied smile, and a bag slung over his shoulder, flanked by two huge men. The thief grinned and said that he thought he was entitled to compensation for the recent incident, and this coin would be enough. Danberg looked at him without much interest, dark circles under his eyes, holding a round coin in his hands. The big men moved closer to him, and Danberg looked up at them. One of them said, "How could this boy really do something like that? He's just a kid." The thief came up behind them with an umbrella open over his head and added angrily that they should think what they were saying. He couldn't have been fooled by an ordinary boy, and that they should be more careful, because he probably had some kind of weapon hidden away. Danberg turned his attention to him and, with a calm expression on his face, recognized him and told the thief that he was the same pickpocket he had encountered earlier in the day. The thief made a face and shouted obscenities in his direction. Danberg, with the same calm expression on his face, held up a coin and asked if they had any change, by the way, and that he would like to change this very coin. The two huge men immediately got flustered and opened their mouths in surprise, saying that it was a platinum coin, and who he was anyway. The thief immediately snatched the coin from him in a quick motion with a satisfied smile on his face. He grinned and said that he didn't have any change, but he would take the coin as moral damages. Danberg calmly said that he didn't need much, and let them give him at least what they had. The thief shouted in displeasure and frowned, saying that he probably wasn't listening to him at all. Suddenly they were interrupted by another voice, who loudly declared that 3 grown men had never been seen molesting a small child, and that they stop immediately. Everyone's attention snapped to a man in a blue uniform with long green hair. A sword was strapped to his belt, and an umbrella was spread over his head. He looked at them gravely, frowning. Someone hesitantly asked him who he really was. The green-haired man came closer with the same disgruntled face, and the big guys on either side of him told him to just go where he was going, and he didn't want fresh scars on his pretty face. The man said nothing, and then at the same time struck a quick blow to one of the thugs. After that, he immediately darted towards the other man, so that he didn't have time to react in any way, and only staggered to the side when the guy threw an equally fast blow to the second man. Both big men were now lying on the ground as the thief stared at the scene in front of him in silence. With an indifferent face, he turned to the thief and told him to get out of here while he was still begging nicely. The thief scratched his cheek uncertainly and said that yes, he would like that too, but he wasn't sure if his friends would listen. The 2 big men were already up and grinning behind the man's back. He only managed to turn around when they immediately landed a few punches on him. The poor man fell to the ground, blood spurting from his nose, and the thief and the 2 big men began to walk away, saying one last word that they would see each other again. The man continued to lie on the ground as Danberg sat and watched him. He asked if Danberg was okay, and the boy didn't say anything, just continued to stare at the man on the ground. After a while, they found themselves in a local tavern. There were several dishes on the table in front of Danberg, and he continued to eat them madly one by one, filling his mouth. The man sat across from him and told him to eat more slowly, and if he didn't eat enough, he would order more. The man smiled and said that his name was Lis von Carter, and Danberg could just call him Lis, and asked what the guy's name was. Danberg looked away uncertainly and answered slowly that his first name was Dan or Mark, and Liz took that as a full name, saying that Danmark had a cool name. Danberg thought to himself that it sounded like the name of a country. Liz asked him if he had a place to spend the night, and Danberg silently waved his head from side to side, still stuffing his stomach. Liz added that if this is the case, then he can stay here today. Liz smiled and told Danberg not to worry, and that he wasn't a bad person, and that his dream was to become a knight, and that was why he was trying to help. Suddenly, a strange voice interrupted their conversation, loudly addressing the young man as if he were a brother. They shifted their gaze and there was a girl with bright red hair tied in ponytails at the sides. Surprised, Liz addressed her as Ellis. Ellis immediately put her hands on her hips and asked in disgust that he had brought someone here again. Liz smiled uncertainly and wanted to explain. Suddenly, Ellis shifted her attention and noticed the fresh abrasions on Liz's face, and loudly asked what was wrong with his face. Liz scratched his cheek awkwardly and said that he just ran into bandits. The girl immediately said loudly that he had snatched it again, trying to help someone in trouble. And how long can this go on? How is he going to get to the island in such and such a state? Danberg watched from the sidelines as brother and sister squabbled. Danberg continued to chew, and his mind clung to the word island. Alice turned her stern gaze in the guy's direction and he immediately jumped up, laughing nervously. The girl continued to stare at him with a displeased, searching gaze. She turned abruptly and started to walk away, saying one last thing. Just let Liz try to tell her that he couldn't go with her. Liz turned his attention back to Danberg and smiled, saying that this was his sister, and she was very irritable lately due to the fact that she was very tired, and that he might not pay much attention to her and continued to eat. Danberg said nothing for a moment, and then said that he was curious about something. Liz looked back at him questioningly, waiting for the question. Danberg asked if he knew anything about the local currency, and Liz asked him what exactly he meant. Danberg explained that the fact was that he came from a long way away, so he didn't understand what kind of money was being used here. Liz replied understandingly that it must have been hard for him to get here. The man added and said that he would try to explain everything as clearly as possible. In total, there are 8 units of currency in the empire. Liz will list them in ascending order: iron, copper, bronze, nickel, silver coins, silver, high-grade silver coins, gold and platinum coins. Liz took out a couple of coins and showed them off, saying that they are, for example, copper and iron coins, and unfortunately he does not have samples of each denomination, so he will not be able to show them to the guy. Ordinary people use cookies. Liz took out paper and pencil and started to continue the explanation, saying that it turns out that 1 iron coin is equal to 1 felk. 1 copper coin is equal to 5 iron or 5 felk. A bronze coin is 2 times more valuable than a copper coin, so it is equivalent to 10 felk. And if you continue the list, it turns out like this. Liz showed a sheet with inscriptions and explanations. Danberg picked up the paper and studied it carefully. Danberg asked how 1 platinum coin could be valued. Liz thoughtfully stretched out and said that for 6-7 gold coins you can rent a small estate for a month, which means that for 1 platinum coin you can rent a huge estate. Danberg stared at him in shock, his eyes wide in surprise. Horrified, he thought about what was going on. Was he trying to pay for the gum with a coin worth tens of millions? He remembered the moment when the salesman bowed at his feet and asked for mercy, and that he would give him everything he wanted. Just let him not buy his building. Danberg mentally apologized to everyone who got in his way. After a while, Danberg and Liz were in the room, and Liz escorted him out, telling him at the door that he could get comfortable and feel more comfortable, while he went to see his sister. Danberg nodded uncertainly and said it was fine. He sat down on the bed. There was another bed in front of him, and there were several nightstands nearby. Danberg sat in silence, thinking about something. Outside, the rain continued to fall heavily, and only one window in the house was lit. Danberg laid out all his contents, surrounded by several weapons, armor, and the rest of his possessions. He crossed his arms and thought about how he was wondering if he could sell any of it. A bag of platinum coins lay nearby. He had so many platinum coins, but he couldn't pay them off. Danberg picked up one of the knives and looked at it carefully, thinking that he had no choice but to sell some of the weapons, thereby receiving money for living. Danberg reached out and conjured a small portal, dark blue in color, in which several bright dots glittered. He started poking into it, saying that, as expected, the space magic outside the village worked much better, and he was also doing a good job of cleaning up the place beforehand. Suddenly, he was interrupted by a noise outside the door and spun around. Lys opened the door a crack and peeked in with a smile on his face and saw Danberg on the bed, sleeping peacefully on the bed under the covers. Lys decided that he had already fallen asleep and added that apparently the guy was very tired and needed to be quieter. Danberg opened one of his eyes slightly, still pretending to be asleep. Outside, the sun was already slowly beginning to bloom. Lys was lying on the bed and sleeping peacefully. The sun was shining from the window, entering the room through the window. Lys was sleeping peacefully, and on the nightstand next to him was a note that read, "Thank you so much for the night's lodging and food, Dan." Danberg continued his journey, flying like an arrow over the houses. With a focused face, he thought that he needed to get a proper identity card first, and if he was constantly mistaken for an aristocrat, it would make him too conspicuous. It was necessary to find someone who could help him with this. Danberg continued to jump from the top of the building's roofs as the sun shone high in the sky. The thief was walking down the street with two big men flanking him. The men asked him what he was going to do with that platinum coin, and shouldn't he share it with them. Another confirmed his words and added that it was true, and that a couple of gold coins would be enough for them. The thief with a serious face told them to be patient for a while, and that it was quite problematic to change this coin. They should be especially careful right now. Suddenly, the thief turned around and noticed that the two men had disappeared somewhere. He turned his head around in confusion and wondered what was going on, and where they had suddenly gone. He didn't notice the shadow that quickly appeared in front of him, and turned as soon as he heard the greeting. A loud shout rang out in the back streets. The thief was lying on the ground, and Danberg was standing next to him and with a smile on his face declared that the first mission was completed. The sun shone brightly in the sky, falling on the treetops. The thief slowly regained consciousness after being tied to a huge tree with a rope in the middle of the forest. He opened one eye slightly, leaving the other blackened and closed. He slowly began to come to his senses and tried to figure out what had happened. Next to him, a voice announced that he was finally awake. The thief shifted his gaze and saw a huge man in front of him, with bright white eyes and huge scars all over his body, and a short mohawk on his head. The thief screamed loudly and asked him who he was and what was going on here, demanding that he be untied immediately. The man moved a little away from him and broke a tree, pointing at him with his hand and saying that if you continue to make such a noise, you will do the same to him. The thief immediately shook in fear and howled. The goon added that he had heard that there was a person in this village who was making fake identity cards, and he needed to find out who exactly it was. The thief shook and replied in a shaky voice that he had never heard of anything related to identity cards. The man looked at him in silence. A second later, it hit the top of the tree above his head, and the tree trunk immediately flew off in a couple of seconds. The thief immediately screamed in horror and shook even harder. The man leaned over him and, with a grim expression on his face, told him to answer immediately if he wanted to live. The thief immediately gave up and loudly said that he would tell everything. He squeezed his eyes shut and shouted loudly that he really had never heard of anyone making fake IDs, but he knew someone who might be in the know. The man said nothing, and then said that it was great, and where exactly he could find it. The man was walking through the woods, leaving the thief alone. He slowed down and took out a coin, examining it carefully. He thought that he had found out the right information and returned the money, 2 cases at a time. He flipped the coin, and it flipped in the air, after which the man deftly caught it. The image began to dissipate, revealing Danberg's true form. He smiled contentedly and continued on his way. Inside the tavern, several men were sitting at various tables when everyone's attention shifted to the man who had walked inside. He was dressed in an expensive suit and carried a walking stick in his other hand. Danberg thought to himself, as he looked around at the people inside, that he seemed to have made a bit of a mistake with his reincarnation. Danberg made his way inside as all the eyes of the locals were directed in his direction. Suddenly, a girl at the counter appeared in front of him, addressing him with a sweet smile. She had short red hair and a tight black dress, and she said with a smile on her face that she hadn't seen him here before. And was he really looking for something in particular? Danberg's mouth opened uncertainly. Inwardly, he thought that this person was very difficult to meet. But if he did everything right, it wouldn't be too difficult. He remembered the thief's words. Danberg moved closer to the counter and asked for a cold, dark beer and fresh seafood for an appetizer. The girl's gaze immediately changed, and she narrowed her eyes slightly as she looked at the man in front of her. After a few seconds, she turned around and ordered the man to follow her. Both of them had already gone down the stairs and into the dimly lit room. Danberg thought to himself that they were taking too long to descend. The girl walked in front of him with an unreadable expression on her face. Suddenly they stopped, and Danberg saw a huge seal in front of him. It shone brightly in the dark room, emitting a light blue light. It was amazing to see a magic barrier in such a place. The girl stretched out her hand in front of her, and a light blue light began to radiate from her hand. The barrier dissipated, leaving behind bright rays of light. The girl glanced over her shoulder and called out to the man, inviting him to follow her. Danberg said nothing, just stared straight ahead. Danberg and the girl went inside, where soft light streamed out. The girl was sitting at the table with her hands folded on top of each other. Her face was covered with a veil, and she was wearing a purple-colored robe on her head. Behind the girl was a shelf with various files on it, and lanterns shone blue on the ceiling. She opened her eyes a crack, and they were a bright green color. Danberg's mouth dropped open in surprise as the other woman disappeared through the doorway. The girl at the table asked what it was worth just like that. Danberg continued to stare ahead in surprise, his mouth hanging open. He looked at her and wondered who she was. There were 6 magic spells installed in this place. What he saw earlier was a magic barrier, 2 defensive spells, 2 more attack magic spells, and 1 last illusion magic to hide what's on that wall. Danberg turned his gaze to the wall where the portrait hung. The girl drew his attention away from his own thoughts and asked him what exactly had brought him here. And Danberg immediately roused himself and turned his gaze to her. Danberg pulled out a chair and sat down across from the woman. He directly asked her if she could get him an ID card. The girl giggled softly under her veil and said that an ID card wasn't too difficult, but he would have to get the ingredients to create it personally, and she needed a beast or ogre bone. Danberg listened to her in silence, then reached behind his back to conjure a bone. He handed the bone to her on the table and placed it in front of her, causing her to start up in surprise. The girl took the bone in her hands and studied it carefully, opening her eyes wide and saying that he was an amazing person, that he even brought a beast bone with him. She went on and added, which class would he like to belong to, commoner or maybe knighthood? Danberg responded and asked if it was possible to get the status of a baron or higher. The girl immediately frowned and replied that of course not, and was he asking because he really didn't know that. Danberg looked at her questioningly. The girl explained that the identity cards of people from high society are superimposed with magic to avoid forgeries. And of course, she can try, but does not promise that it will be possible to make the ID card identical. Danberg said with a calm face that it didn't matter and that he would handle the magic himself. He thought to himself that it wouldn't be too difficult for him. The girl looked at him carefully in return and said that it was fine, and she would do as he wished. The girl said that the price will be 15 million Felix together with the prepayment. Danberg said nothing, then took out a platinum coin and placed it on the table, asking if it was enough. The girl looked at the coin in silence, and then said that he seemed to be a very rich man. Danberg said nothing, and after a few seconds asked if she could get something other than her ID card, and that money won't be a problem for him. Outside, the sun shone brightly, illuminating the 2-story stone building. In his hands, the young man held a certificate that had several inscriptions and a magic seal on it. Great, he finally had his ID card, and now he would be able to walk around everywhere without any special problems. Danberg smiled, studying the sign carefully. Several papers and various maps were spread out in front of him. Map of the island. He also got information about the imperial troops and nobles, and he also has a magic book. A few books lay to one side. Danberg picked up the bag of coins and smiled contentedly, saying that he had finally managed to change the money. Now he can definitely not worry about anything. The robed girl continued to sit at the table. There were several platinum coins on her desk. She wondered what this guy was like, because he didn't look like an ordinary person to her at all. The girl took off her robes, looking ahead thoughtfully. Privately, she thought that it was worth showing to Big Mama. Village of Ravens. The headman was standing with his face turned to the window, chatting with one of the older sisters. He asked her if they had been able to discover his location, and she replied from behind him that her men were scouring all the imperial villages, and that it wasn't that easy. The man turned his face back to the window and frowned, saying that yes, Danberg could hide using magic. Hestia bowed her head slightly and told him not to worry too much, and her father glanced at her again. She replied that she expected her uncle to have received their letter by now. The man was sitting at a desk, holding a letter in his hands, studying its contents. The man was wearing a green suit, a thick mustache on his face, and was reading the contents carefully. He realized that Danberg had run away from home, and there was definitely a problem with that. Danberg was standing in a shopping mall. Inside were weapons and various items. Several swords were placed in a small oblong vase, and next to it was a similar quiver with maps. Danberg pointed out what he needed, saying that he would take this and that. Danberg turned around with a smile on his face when the merchant asked him if he was going to travel or something. And where was he going with all this? The young man replied that all this would be useful to him for one case. Danberg went outside, and his attention was drawn to voices nearby, and one of them was saying that it was too expensive, and that the price should be lowered a little. He heard familiar voices and turned in the direction they came from, and saw Ellis and Liz standing behind the counter, haggling with the vendor. The man answered them and said that so be it, he would sell them something for 5 coins of nickel silver. Ellis let out a cry of displeasure and said, frowning, that the goods should be taken for 2 coins while she still offers. Liz smiled awkwardly, glancing in her direction, and said that this was too much and that she should just pay 5 coins. Ellis screamed in frustration and told him to shut up, and that it was all his fault, and didn't he realize that because of his excessive kindness, they didn't have any money left. Liz was about to object when the merchant intervened and said that how could he sell them the goods for just 2 coins. The girl replied with displeasure that only 2 coins and no more for the product. Danberg walked up to them and asked if they would sell for 3, and all 3 of them turned their attention to him. They were surprised to see a guy who had a bunch of equipment on his back. He smiled at them kindly. After a while, they were sitting at a table in a tavern full of people. There were several dishes on the table, and Danberg was sitting directly across from his brother and sister, who were sitting next to each other. Liz said that he was already worried, because he suddenly left out of the blue in the early morning. Danberg hesitantly replied that he just had some business to attend to. Ellis squinted to the side and scowled as she continued to fill her mouth with food, saying that she thought Danberg was just embarrassed. Liz smiled awkwardly and exclaimed her name. Danberg smiled awkwardly and said that he would pay for lunch so they could eat as much as they wanted. Liz smiled as he looked in the boy's direction and said that it looked like he had managed to get some money, and Danberg, with the same friendly smile on his face, replied that he just took some with him before leaving his village, because he couldn't exchange them yesterday. He couldn't use them either. Ellis continued to frown and stare at him while Danberg talked about how that was the very reason they could eat as much as they wanted. Liz said that it turns out that now he also has a place to stay. Danberg tilted his head slightly forward and replied with a smile on his face that he actually wanted to go to the island as well. Liz smiled cordially and asked what it means that he will go with them. Alice immediately flushed with displeasure beside him. Danberg smiled and thanked them for the invitation, thinking that the distance from here to the island would be about 2,000 kilometers. If it flies, it will take 2 or 3 days to get there, but it should not waste its power. Danberg closed his eyes and added that he didn't know if it would be rude of him to ask for them like this, and the girl immediately cut him off and said with a scowl that she actually would. Liz ignored her and replied that everything was fine, and that the more people on the road, the more fun it would be. Ellis said indignantly that he should know about their financial situation, and that it was very difficult to get train tickets, and if Danberg asked for food again. Danberg listened to them with an awkward smile on his face. He responded to her protests and told her not to worry, and that he had enough money not to burden them, and that he could even borrow it if anything happened. Ellis looked at him with a surprised expression and was silent for a while, and then she asked him how much he could give her, and Danberg asked her how much she needed. The Imperial Palace. The majestic building towered high. A man in a green uniform stood in the aisle and a voice called out, greeting him as a friend and addressing him as Vladdy von de Cantblade. The blonde-haired man with a beard on his face smiled and said that he had done a great job protecting the empire from evil forces. It was the Emperor, Bentel von Bahamut de Orlean Eltria, and behind him stood a girl with short red hair, bright eyes, and horns on her head. It was Orpheus Draconian. Vladdy replied that he was only doing his job, addressing him as Your Imperial Majesty. Vladdy sat down across from him, slouching in a chair and propping his head up on his hands, his legs propped up on the table. Bentel immediately shouted indignantly and said that he had already warned him not to put his feet up on the table, and he should know how much the table costs. Vladdy held out his hand and apologized just as informally. The Emperor told him to talk faster about what happened to him, as he was too busy. Vladdy hesitated a little. He said with a smile on his face that his younger nephew had run away, and the man asked again. Bentel laughed and asked, "So what?" and not to worry, because he couldn't think that the people from the village of Ravens would start running around and beating up everyone without hitting them. Vladdy replied with the same smile and said that he obviously wouldn't worry about it, and that he hoped they wouldn't wipe out a small village, and that the problem was that his brother had chosen Danberg as his successor. Bentel looked at him in surprise and asked again. He crossed his arms and asked how old the boy was now, and Vladdy hesitantly replied that he was about 16. The emperor asked if this was even possible. Flatty replied that he could not imagine how strong this boy was, and that at the age of 12, he was the only one who defeated a dragon with magic. The emperor looked at him with wide eyes. He was silent for a couple of seconds before getting up and walking away, saying that he had already mentioned that he had too much to do and needed to take care of the citizens. Flatty asked him what about his nephew. Standing in the doorway, Bentel turned around and said that he was part of his family, and such problems usually have to be solved with relatives. He said goodbye, and Flatty said nothing, looking away in disgust. The train was rushing along the railway at great speed. Ellie sat with her arms crossed and her face turned the other way as Liz put her things on the top shelf. Danberg sat across from them. Liz turned his gaze to Sister and asked if she really had to take first-class tickets, and that this train was full of cheaper seats. Ellis frowned and said that it was a full 4 days' drive to the island, and how could you survive such a long trip while sitting in business class? Besides, they might have been able to afford these places before, if someone hadn't become a troublesome virtue. Liz didn't say anything, just continued to put things on the shelf in silence. The girl turned her gaze to Denberg and added that in any case, she didn't have to worry about him, because then they would definitely return the money to Denberg. The guy smiled nervously in response and said that it was fine. The train continued to speed along the road as several goblins came out of the forest, looking at the train that was passing by. The train continued to run along the road. Outside the window, green landscapes flew by. Danberg was sitting with a red book open, on which was written on the laws of the empire. The girl sat in silence for a while with her arms crossed over her chest, and then interrupted him and said that she was surprised at his concentration, because it had been almost an hour since the departure, and he was still studying continuously. Liz put his finger to his mouth and told her not to disturb him and to be quiet. Ellis smiled and added that apparently he was going to take his exams in the summer, and that she had heard that the civil service exams were held twice a year in winter and in summer. Danberg smiled and said that it was, and added that it would take place in July, so he had a little more than a month left. Liz said that if you think about it, July was just around the corner. With a smile, he said that he hoped that each of them would achieve their goal. Danberg enters the civil service, and he will become a knight. Ellis turned her gaze in his direction and said that he would die for the sake of others, and how could someone like him be knighted? Liz replied to Sister that she was exaggerating too much, and that this was the essence of chivalry. Suddenly, their conversation broke off and they noticed a commotion outside and that the train had suddenly stopped. They looked out the window and took a closer look. Ellis and Liz stood looking out of the window, and the girl said it was strange, because it was still a long way to the nearest station, and Liz confirmed her words when Danberg came to the realization. He looked out the window and saw a goblin clinging to the train and hanging on to it. Danberg took off, and all of a sudden the window exploded, sending Alice flying, and she cleared her throat to see Danberg standing over her, shielding her from the explosion. It took her a moment to realize what had happened when Danberg asked her with a smile on his face if she was okay, and the girl immediately flushed, her mouth and eyes opening wide in surprise. The three of them shifted their gaze and saw a goblin in front of them. The goblin was lying on the ground, slammed into the wall, blood dripping from the corner of its lips. Liz looked at him in surprise and exclaimed as he talked about why the goblin was here in the first place. Suddenly they were interrupted by a shout, and Liz went to the shelf with things and said that he would go to investigate, and that this would not work. Ellis looked at her brother and asked him what he was talking about. He drew his sword and frowned, telling an indignant Ellis that he thought these goblins were attacking the train and he should have checked the situation. Liz went to the exit and threw open the doors, while a puzzled sister continued to sit on the floor and tried to stop him. He turned to her with a smile and told her not to worry and wait for him here. Ellis was about to stop him when the girl jumped off, but the door slammed and Liz left. Sister only had time to scold him in the wake and say that he was a fool. The girl turned her attention to the goblin and the broken window as she rose from her seat. Liz was still walking through the opening of the train when he heard people shouting. A scene appeared in front of him, in which the goblins began to attack the panicked people around them. One of the goblins laughed and told them to grab anything of value they found and just kill the people who resisted. One of the goblins swung his sword over the girl's head, and Liz immediately appeared next to him and slashed at him with his sword, cutting the goblin apart. One of the goblins immediately charged towards the sword, but the boy deftly avoided the attack and was able to get around it, cutting it into pieces in the same way. Liz turned to the girl who was about to be attacked and asked if she was all right. The girl blushed slightly and answered hesitantly that she did. He told her that the back cars were safe while the crowd of goblins began to rise and appear behind him. Lys glanced back at them with a nervous smile, and then they ran towards him with a shout. Suddenly, a bright light appeared and cut through the goblins, engulfing the entire crowd, causing them to fall to the floor at once. Lys looked around blankly. Danberg was standing outside the train, his arm outstretched in a blue glow, and he was floating in the air. He looked down and said that he shouldn't have been delayed by such creatures, and that he should get to the island as soon as possible to study for the exam. He glanced back toward the woods and noticed that the belt was slightly off the track. Ellis looked out the window and saw the figure of Danberg floating in the sky, looking straight ahead with a serious face.